word for all of y'all. Reference, Kessler, if you want to remove your last name, now is the time to do so. Awesome. Okay, so settler colonialism. This is the lecture that you are in. If you didn't know that you're in this lecture, now is also the time to leave. It is an advanced lecture, so for y'all's reference, if you don't know a lot of K jargon, this might be a little bit confusing. Because there are so few of y'all today, I do not mind making clarifications or going over some of the more basics. But assuming that y'all attended critique structure, some of the jargon will make some sense. Okay, settler colonialism, understanding applications in debate and in real life. So what is settler colonialism? This is a word that gets thrown around. I'm sure you've heard of it before, give back the land. You can type it into the chat or unmute yourself, raise your hand, whatever. What is settler colonialism? Yes, Valdi.
Isn't it basically like a group of people come into us, a group of people come into our foreign land and they end up taking control of that land in some shape or form?
Yeah, exactly. So if it'll, there we go. Oop. Okay, so nope, not the second. Okay, so settler colonialism is a variety of actions in which a colonizer claims indigenous land. Generally, it's with the intention of taking the land for their own and erasing and replacing natives. Essentially, they come, they remove the people, and then they use the land for themselves. Colonies are created, and then, yes, Kessler.
Does it have anything to do with the expression they came, they saw, they conquered?
Kind of. We can get to that in scene and education. But essentially the colonies are created and indigenous people are kind of forced off their land because of how the settlers come and make sure that the land is for themselves. We can see this in education, the idea of barren land, the idea that natives were savage, like Kessler was saying, they came, they conquered. Textbooks generally don't account for the native violence or violence towards natives. So a lot of the times it's the idea that the settlers came and then they saw this great land that was completely inhabited and had so much opportunity for them, without taking account the fact that there were natives there were a group of people who have already kind of settled on the land and had been there for a very long time. Another big part of settler colonialism and kind of word that gets thrown around is sovereignty. And this is just an enlightenment period where you can control yourself. This is when we kind of get the idea that you have subjectivity, the idea that you have a sense of self and who you are as a person. And part of that was owning land and property. Most of this had to do with the fact that the land had to be used correctly, who can own the most land, how owning land is a big part of subjectivity. So like women weren't allowed to own land versus men are allowed to own men are allowed to own land, and how land ended up playing a big part. Who can own land? Who is able to own land? Does that make sense for everyone? I'm looking at some unconfused faces. Okay, so the K argues that settler colonialism is ongoing. A lot of people conceptualize settler colonialism as something that happened. We came, we removed natives, we pushed them back off our land, and well, we're not doing that anymore, right? They have their own native land within our country. There's no more native violence. They have their own sovereignty. This is not a problem anymore. The K, and arguably empirics show that settler colonialism is ongoing. We can see this through how native lands are controlled, how natives are forced to follow various laws imposed by either Canada or the US or whatever other country that came and settled on their land. And just the way that natives are still controlled. And whatever the other team is proposing in that round makes set call worse. A lot of the ways that we can see the other team being settler colonialist is the action is in act of the settler. A lot of the times the very surface level idea is that the USFG is the settler state. It's the state of government that is from the settler. Therefore, any USFG action is settler colonialist. But obviously, if that were the case, then every affirmative team that uses the United States federal government would lose, and every team on the negative could just go for set call. So the debate definitely gets more nuanced than just the USFG is bad. It can also be settler technologies. So what structures are they using? What assumptions are being made? And how those assumptions are the idea of what a settler might be thinking. Against other critiques, it's generally addressing the lens that they're looking at the round in, or whatever issue impact that they're trying to solve. So how it includes or excludes Indigenous people, and how their alternative chooses to solve. So do they address the Native issue, or how Natives are included in their ideas of race, ideas of inequality, and this is usually great against postmodern critiques and against ideas of creating subjectivity. So if the other team is trying to create them an idea of self, generally the set call K is a great way to go, because it does argue that trying to create yourself as a subject usually means that you're creating yourself at the risk of violence towards natives. I'm going to slow down here. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, I see Valdi nodding, Vamsi nodding, Rudy, we're good. Okay, Olivia, can't see you. Rian, can't see you either, but that's fine. Okay, so before we start on this, can anyone tell me the parts of a critique? Feel free to, again, either type it into the chat or raise your hand, unmute yourself, whatever the case might be. Okay, I'm staring at, oh, there we go, Rudy. Yes, link, impacts, and alternative, great. So let's go over the link. So I've divided set call links into three kind of categories. This is how I conceptualize it. You might conceptualize it in a different way. The first is impact links. Impact links are generally relating to the impact that the affirmative or whatever critique you're going against is trying to solve. So what do you think some common impact links are? I know we're low on participation, but yes, Kessler.
It's sort of exactly what it sounds like. So it's links about the impact that are used a lot.
Great. So then what is a common impact link for set call?
I don't know. I just only remember the common impact link definition.
Okay, that's fine. So some common impact links. It'll take a second to pop up. First is fear of extinction. A lot of people get really confused on this one. Sometimes I get confused on this one. It's a very, very generic link. And it's a very generic impact link because almost everything leads to extinction in debate. You didn't already know that, now you do. Generally, the argument is that settlers love to pretend that their death is impending. The doom is coming, and it's coming fast. We're all going to be dead soon, and our sense of self is completely destroyed. And that justifies native violence, or violence towards natives. Generally, it links into almost every affirmative. The argument is that the settler pretending that their extinction is about to happen means that they push aside natives and the problems with that is happening towards indigenous people, and this justifies a crazy amount of actions that are arguably bad, purely for the fact that they think that they're about to die. Then we have reform impacts. I kind of threw these all into a bunch. It's generally that the settler is coming and attempting to change, which is impossible and unsustainable. It usually is because the position that they take or their inherent inability to do so, like because of who they are unable to change themselves, which means whatever they're trying to change in policy, in the government, in how our country works is probably not going to work. A great example is climate change. Usually the argument with climate change is that solutions are impossible because settlers don't recognize race in how they address the climate crisis. So a lot of the times the argument is that indigenous people have already faced the climate crisis, or that the blackness increases your chances or increases how you view climate change in your daily lives. Their focus on subjectivity of self as a settler makes it impossible for them to find a solution to solve the issues that are basically already happening, but because as the settler, you are unable to see that. And then this one I put in impact links. Generally though, it's another larger impact that uses pain narratives and pain representation. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially when they read evidence that is citing other people's pain. It's citing someone who was interviewed and is talking very explicitly of what type of pain they were going through. And the argument here is that it's a settler attempt to relate with the oppressed. And by the settler attempting to relate with oppressed people, it's quite violent because they're taking the stories of others for their own interpretation, and that removes the other's ability to speak. Because the other has told a story, another person has told their story, and now as a settler, as someone whose story is not that story, has taken it for your own advantage, for your own interpretation, for your own attempt to enforce whatever change that you want to create. Pain narratives and pain reps is generally a very common link. You're going to see it in other Ks as well. It's just often used in the set call K because, again, it's very generic. And the last one that I have in impact links is a solvency assumption. I say it's a solvency assumption. It's more of just how they have assumed their impact happens. So a lot of the times, I'm going to use the climate change example again. A lot of the time settlers like, yo, climate change, super bad. We need to solve it by doing XYZ. And then the set call K would argue that, yo, you created climate change. Making green energy isn't going to solve the problem. You came, you took the land, you destroyed it, and now you're going to pretend that you can fix it. And that's kind of like a settler's assumption of how the impact happens. Okay, I'm going to take a pause again. Any questions? No question is too stupid. This took me forever to understand. I was writing this slide and I was also very confused for like a good couple minutes. How are we doing? If you need me to slow down, I can always slow down. I'm seeing nods, so we're going to continue. We have common policy links. I'm going to ask the crowd again, what do you think some common policy links are for the set call K? So we understand that set call is because of a settler coming in and colonizing a land. They're staying with the intent of never leaving. What are some policy links? Let's use those critical thinking skills. Dang. All right. That is okay. We're here to learn. Common and policy links. Oh, Valdi, go ahead. We're going to go back. Go ahead, Valdi.
I probably assume that Composition are probably like ideas that the study use from like people who are colonizing to like reason why they're colonizing. So for example, like it's like let's say I make Americans and like the colonizing it. If you make someone think like what is her for land, like colonizers say, oh, this is how we live like outside for them. They also be part of the fight. So now the country take the land. The country like take Congress to replace and to reason the actions because their actions.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the times, because with policy, it does come from America, it comes from the US and their federal government, a lot of the times the links are very clear, which is why it's such a common critique. I have put these into a couple categories. These are very common ones you're going to see because of how policy apps are done. They're often going to argue for hegemony. If you don't know how to say that word, please learn it. Liberal reform, HR, and tech. If you're doing LD, I think a lot of these are very applicable to what's about to come in this next season. If you're doing policy, there's already stuff that's coming out. So if you all want to see more specific ones on how it affects criminal justice, go ahead and take a look. So first is hedge. Hedge is a form of settler violence, is the main thesis of that argument, and genocide and expanding settler control is expanding hegemony. Generally, it's because the US, big bad, big settler state, expanding hedge means that they get to control more and they're expanding their ability to control as a settler. Of course, there's also an argument for anti-hegemony, and generally affirmatives that say hedge is bad don't account for the settler control that has happened historically and is currently happening within our systems. So this is generally an argument for like a move to relieve settler guilt or wipe the slate clean, tabula rasa. The idea that the settler state, the USFG, has not done bad things in the past is what anti-hedge is usually arguing for. Like, you have not recognized the historical impacts that the settler state has created, and by simply saying that, oh, hedge is bad, we can just remove that, is not recognizing those issues. Okay, liberal reform. It's a continuation of the settler story where they come and replace natives. Generally, liberal reform, people usually think it's good. A lot of the times, though, the Sekulke says that, oh, this is bad. This is the settler state saying, no, it's okay, we're trying to help now. Except that only continues the settler story where they come and they replace natives. They focus on their own issues instead of focusing on what they have done to the indigenous people. This one gets a little bit more tricky. You're gonna have to read the literature basing this. It's usually just one or two cards if you want to take a look at that. Just for y'all's reference, if y'all go on Open Evidence, I link this somewhere else in the Google Classroom, I think. If not, I'll put it up after. Open Evidence has a bunch of stuff that you can read. SetCall has been pretty common for a while now, so a lot of the times the links are there for you to read. Okay, HR. Human rights doesn't account for natives is generally the argument, and by solving for these HR abuses that the affirmative proposes, it's a use of settler structures. Again, a facade of the settler attempting to change. So, similar to like the liberal reform, HR argues that the USFG trying to solve other people's problems is just more violent way of doing whatever they're trying to do because of the settler structures that they're attempting or they're going to use in order to solve these problems. It's just like settler state, big bad, continuing to try and pretend to solve other people's problems just makes the settler state quote unquote look good, which exacerbates the issue because then we never get the chance to recognize that the USFG has done some pretty awful things and how that has expanded into other communities that are not just Native people. Tech, this is going to be applicable to one of the LD topics this year. If you haven't looked at that, they're on a slide coming up for a drill that we're doing. But essentially, tech ruins Native lives by destroying land and resources. This comes from like empirics of when the settlers came originally and they destroyed the land. They tried to use it as much as possible. And by increasing tech, they depleted land resources as well as just ruin the climate. Tech is a form, there's another argument that tech is a form of war created by settlers, because technology now is also like a competition. Take 5G, for example. We're out here trying to create war of like who can create the most technically advanced items, who can make the best weapons, who can project themselves into the tech world as the most strong and most competent. And that's how the settler state is creating a new form of war where we're trying to create just like advancements over and over and over again to kind of create a different type of control where it's like, you need to buy my products, you need to use my products, I'm the best, you're going to be afraid of my guns, my planes, you're going to buy them from me. And that's another way that the settler state is kind of increasing their control. Okay, on to common K-links. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. Honestly, this common K-link slide is pretty vague, mainly because critiques usually have to do with the writers who back whatever K you're reading. So a lot of these are more towards the end goal or the impact of a critique. You'll see that one of these is a philosopher specific, like Deleuze, Edelman, Baudrillard. These all have common specific set called links. But if you don't understand Deleuze, you're not going to understand the K-link. If you don't understand Edelman, you're not going to understand the K-link. I'm just going to assume that this is something that if you are terribly interested in, you will go in and read some. If you are interested in it and don't know where to start, I'm going to throw my email in the chat later and you can email me about it. But we're going to go on to inclusion, race, and fluid identity. So inclusion. You'll quickly find that the Sakol K has links that go both ways. So the hedge versus anti-hedge, it seems like nothing can be done right. So that happens with inclusion. So attempts at inclusion are forms of integration. The argument is generally that trying to include Native people is worse than worse or just as bad as disinclusion or not recognizing them, because inclusion is like integration where without addressing the issues that have happened in the past, you are just assuming that they will join and be integrated into whatever structures that you're going to use. Race is generally that the other team's view of race with whatever critique they're running is insufficient because they don't account for natives in their understanding of race. And then we have fluid identity. Fluid identity is just the argument that your identity doesn't have to be like, I'm an Asian American woman, therefore blank. And fluid identity is disproportionately harms natives because you kind of try and dilute the idea of a native identity, which is kind of like what the settlers were doing at the very beginning, where they created schools, they created ways to kind of remove Native Americans from their issues. and that trying to get rid of their culture, their language, by controlling their students, their children at the beginning, trying to re-educate them. That's kind of where the fluid identity argument comes from. I'm going to pause and take questions again. Seeing as there are none, maybe. Yes, seeing it as there are none, I'm going to move on. Common impacts. So the first is obvious. And we can see this through the links that we were talking about. It's elimination. It's removing the idea of a native, whether it be the identity or physically. The native identity and Blackness are still seen as killable, seen as worthless, seen as something that we are able to lose, and that's where elimination comes from. Genocide, it's just what genocide is. The entirety of Indigenous people are killed. We have climate change. Climate change is actually, from what I've seen, common, but I've never run into it, honestly. And it's just that settlers create climate change through their attempts to use the land. We talked about this earlier. It's a settler move to innocent. It's just that whatever has been proposed or whatever the affirmative is going to do is just relieving settlers of their own guilt without having to address any problems. Pretty straightforward. These impacts are derived from things that happened in the past. So settler move to innocence is super great though, but a lot of issues you run into that is like, okay, so then how do settlers recognize their issues? And that's where the alt comes in. So common alternatives is stop settlers' subject formation, stop allowing the settler to have a violent formation of self, and their subjectivity often comes at the loss of the elimination of the other, of others, of the idea that the idea that the settler is a subject as someone who needs to continue forming their idea of who they are, controlling who they are, is usually violent towards other people. We can see this often with settlers seeing how they wanted to use land in the past, where they started pushing natives off that land. You can see this with, it's usually again linked to land. And then we have refusal. It's just rejecting whatever the affirmative was and more settler violence. Generally this format comes with rejecting the affirmative or voting for the negative, voting for the affirmative, vice versa if it's a KF. Refusal also comes like refusing settler ideas of land, ideas in education, in academia. Refusal is super common. And then we have performance through speech acts. This is a little bit more tricky. It's just that debate is a platform in academia or to start change, and some sort of in-round action is kind of like similar to a performance where they're stopping the subject formation of self from the settler's perspective. It could also be coming from the judge when we come in from like vote in a neg ballot causes something. The ballot has some sort of impact in solving for the impacts of the critique. Generally, the performance through speech axing, or at least some sort of performance in round, is run simultaneously through the alternative with refusal or subject formation or any other alternative you see. They argue that they have in round and out of round solvency, where in the round they're able to start whatever, and out of the round because of their K being a good idea, they get to neg the ballot. And we get onto that in our framework slide, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. That is the entire K. We have about like 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I'm going to go over answering the K as well as framework, but I want to pause to see if you have any questions. I'm pausing for questions because when I first learned this, I asked like too many questions. Maybe I was just a little lost. Okay, I don't think I'm seeing any questions. Okay, so I would have done a drill just now, but we can do it as a group. So I have 4 resolutions. The first one is the policy resolution, and then I have 3 more, which are proposed LD resolutions. You're only ever going to see a set called K in LD and policy on the circuit level. If you don't know what that means, it's just like the national circuit. This is where all the high-level debate happens. And I was hoping we could create generic K shells for each. Basically, just name a link, name an impact, and some sort of alternative that solves for that impact. Remember that the alternative does have to solve for the impacts outlined in your K. We can go for the first 2 because that one is pretty obvious. It uses the US in their resolution. I'm going to give you all a second to think.
What does compulsory mean?
Good question. Honestly, I did not look into that LD topic. It's probably something that you're going to end up arguing with in the round. Essentially, it's like, I think it's like forcing you to vote. Yeah, you have an obligation to vote. Basically, you don't get a choice. So right now in our system, you are allowed to choose whether or not to vote once you turn 18, whereas in number 3, the resolution is that in democracy that you have to vote, and that is a law. Okay, let's go over number 1. Does someone want to unmute themselves and tell me their generic K shell for number 1? Valdi.
So, me personally, I'm not exactly sure how it gets to because I don't know enough information about the whole justice reform, but one idea I have is like come up with policies that undo damage from what has happened in the past, because I understand that the criminal justice system in the past they have set many policies that kind of were a way to discriminate people of color compared to white people, and they had never undo the damage they had done. It's just to poor communities are more missing for color instead of white people. So that being said, is to invest more into poor communities. It's to cause less crime and give people more access to education and more opportunities to success.
Okay, great, awesome. Yeah, so I predict that that will be super common on this topic. The idea that the USFG trying to solve for this is not actually going to solve for the actual impacts that are happening because of structures that are in place that create inequality, which is probably what the impact is going to be for policing, sentencing, and forensic science in the criminal justice reform. Without actually solving for inequalities, criminal justice reform is not actually going to be able to do anything. That's a great impact that is going to be attempted to solve for. The K is pretty obvious here, I would say. It's just that the idea of policing, sentencing, forensic science, that there needs to be criminal justice reform, cannot happen without recognizing structures, without recognizing inequality that has happened in the past. And if anything, by doing the affirmative or trying to solve for this criminal justice reform is only going to make the issue worse. And as a result, we need to do some sort of recognition, some sort of refusal, whatever alternative they end up doing. Okay, great. Number 2, we're only going to do 1 and 2 because I have 2 more slides to get through. Who have I not heard from today? I'm going to call out Vamsi here. Tell me about number 2. Also, let me know if I'm pronouncing your name wrong.
My name is pronounced Vamshi.
Vamshi. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
It's fine. Okay, so I think that the United States trying to give proportional representation to the system of elections will take away power from the people, and it won't actually give equal representation to all of the different states, because different states have different representation.
Okay, great. So, this is an LD topic. Lily doesn't know how LD topics work because it's supposed to be more of like a morals debate. Luca, if you could chime in here if I'm saying anything wrong, please correct me. But essentially, I think a great thing that you mentioned is that representation, right? The idea of representation and who should be represented is a huge part of the set called K. It's like, yo, your idea of representation is probably not that great. You don't take account for Native people. You don't see other structures that happen where representation isn't viewed as equal. So a lot of affirmatives here are probably going to argue that, like, yeah, this is great for equality, but like, equality for who? Okay, cool. So answering the set call K. Just a few things. Don't screw up and think, yo, set call is true, right? Like, we needed to help Native Americans. And because it's so true, I can't argue it. It's just like a thing. You can argue about race without being racist. It's just how you do it. Harley Pofo Congress debaters generally argue that, like, yo, if we're going to argue about race, like, then we can't do it, because arguably everyone thinks that race is an important factor and we need to be people who are able to accommodate for all. This is not true. We can see this in answering set call. Basically, don't freak out. The first time I saw a K, I literally freaked out so bad and I could not see straight. And I just read whatever I thought I could read. And then at the end of the debate, I was like, wait, I have nothing. And so we're going to dissect it part by part. It's no different than a DA and counterplan combo. So if you are afraid, please don't be. Just a first little thing, answering set call. So we first have the link level debate. No matter what, you have to answer the link. If you did not answer the link, you have probably already messed up and should try and come back from that and answer the link. Usually in the first shell of a set call K on the negative, they're going to read maybe 1 or 2 links. I assure you, coming back in their second speech, they will read at least 5 more. And by the end of the debate, you will have 20 links. And if you didn't answer at least 1 or answered all of them, you have screwed up. Generally, you can group them together. You do not have to have 20 different answers, but you do need to answer the link. So some obvious answers is no link. You never want to link into the K. Because as long as they want to link, they have won something, and the link is a huge part of the K. A great answer is a link turn. Maybe something they did also links into their K, also links into set call. Maybe it also creates a bad impact for settler colonialism, makes their impact even worse on their end, but always have a no link. And I'll get to that on the alternative. If they want to link, they probably won something. the impact. Answering this, even if they win a link, means that if you have won no impact, or that the impact is a lot smaller than they argue it, then it's really going to help you when you try and weigh things at the end through impact calc. If their impact is smaller, diminished, it doesn't matter if they win a link, because obviously nothing's going to happen, even if you do link into setcall. Some obvious answers is no impact. Generally, you can make this thesis not that setcall isn't bad. That is not the only answer to setcall. You can argue that their thesis of what setcall is not real. The thesis is more related to your actions. Your argument is going to be more related to how your actions don't cause more setcall. That you recognize settler violence, but you have to argue that this violence is not happening in your affirmative. You do not need to argue that setcall isn't real. They need a unique impact. If their impact is just some other setcall impact that isn't unique to your plan, that doing some sort of USFG action isn't going to make this issue worse, then their impact is not real, because unless it specifically is caused by your affirmative, then obviously there is no impact to your affirmative happening on the setcall level. Essentially, if you were to tell me that it's super hot outside, and I said, I'm going outside and spraying some water, and they said, that's going to make it hotter, but you don't actually make it any hotter by spraying some water, then there's no impact to you spraying water. I know that's super random example, but essentially, if you didn't make it any hotter, if you don't make setcall any worse by your action, then there's no impact to setcall K. And if it's safe, do an impact turn. This is kind of scary though, because it's hard to impact turn these type of big idea impacts, in my opinion, but do not run this with a link turn, because if you say that they actually link into their own K, but actually their impact is a good thing, which is what the impact turn is, then they're causing a good thing, which tips the scale towards them anyways. The chances of this is low, because it's hard to say that elimination is a good thing, but generally you are just going to argue for a no impact, that whatever impact they're saying is either non-unique to your affirmative, or that the idea of setcall in itself is just not unique, because basically anything at this point can cause settler violence. Okay, on to answering the setcall continued. Answering setcall continued. We have the alt. In my opinion, I think the alt is the weakest part of setcall. And I ran setcall. The alt is always going to be the weakest part of a K, because usually an alternative is some sort of big-brained, like, thinking. There's no literal action, and it's hard to argue that you're going to be able to create, you're going to be able to solve for the entirety of your impact, because the impacts that are chosen are generally super big. So in cross-X, when you hit a setcall K, yes, Kessler.
What does solvency mean?
It's your ability to solve for an impact. Essentially, just like, can you overcome your impact? Is the K conditional? This is always a first question that you need to ask if they're going to, like, propose something, or if there's, like, they have some stance. This just means, like, are they going to go for this in the 2NR or in their last speech? Can they drop this K? Sometimes this ends up being a big part, because they'll argue, like, setcall is the biggest thing ever. We're always going to have to argue about setcall. But then the setcall is conditional. So clearly, setcall isn't the biggest thing in the round, right? Always push on the alt. Why does it solve? How does it solve? And why do you need the ballot in order to solve? This is super important, because usually K debaters will give you some jargony answer, and you want them to really explain how it solves. How, by doing whatever refusal, whatever recognition or speech act, they're able to solve for elimination of natives, and able to solve for that the violence that is happening towards them and has historically happened towards them. in your own speeches, always argue no solvency. Perms are super important. Go for a couple, do a few really good ones though, so that you actually have something to go for, something to continue on in the round that's actually feasible. Sometimes you can even argue that you solve for the impacts better than the alt. This usually happens with soft left AFs. This is affirmatives that claim to solve for HR, claim to solve for human rights abuse, claim to solve for violence to like smaller minorities, etc. And then the alt has to solve the impacts that they have outlined. So if the alternative cannot solve for whatever impacts they say that you're going to cause or that set call causes, then the alternative is not feasible. It's not something that it should be argued because it cannot solve the thing that they want to solve for. Not all judges buy this, but sometimes the negative will drop the alternative and run the K as a DA, or that's something that functions as a DA. Essentially, the link, the affirmative causes the impact that they have outlined in their K. They do not argue that they can solve for it. And this is super big because, like I was saying, if they win a link and you have not functionally won the no impact to set call or no impact to set call as a result of your affirmative, then you're in a tough spot because they probably win that because you link into set call and as a result there's some impact, then you should lose the round, and that can be super big. I am short on time, but I think we can do a few questions at the end here. The last thing I have is framework. I'm going to skip to the TLDR. Framework is super important. If you're the affirmative or the negative, both sides need to be able to weigh their arguments. A big part of the K is that Ks will argue that they have some sort of top-level impact, something that cannot be weighed against hypothetical governmental action, which is what the affirmative is. And the affirmative needs to win that they can weigh some part of their affirmative or all of their affirmative against this K, no matter what, if it's hypothetical or literal, something that can happen in real life. Because if they don't win that, the K is most likely going to win their top-level impact that they're going to solve for, which is super common in set call too, and any K for that matter. So the neg will always argue that the K comes first. And if you're the negative, you always want to argue that the K comes first, and we can argue hypothetical impacts second, but you need to value whatever real world impact, in-round impact that they are able to solve for. Again, the affirmative is always going to argue the entirety of the affirmative can be weighed against the entirety of the critique to have the most fair and educational round. If you do not win framework as the affirmative, you are probably screwed. The K, not so much. Mainly because they have hypothetical and in-round impacts no matter what. That's framework. Any questions? Please ask questions. Questions are really important when you understand things like this. If you don't have any questions, that is okay too. If you come up with questions later, here is my email. Yes, Valdi.
I didn't really understand how to set up a framework.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I didn't really understand how to set up a framework.
Understand what? Sorry.
I've had to
Oh, okay, thank you.
set up the
Great question. I did not go over that. Framework is, who was doing the framework lecture? Luca or Annie, do you know who did the framework lecture? I don't know if they're actually here. Okay, no. Generally, framework is going to be run by the affirmative in their 2AC, their second speech. I'm talking in policy language. It might be different for LD, but essentially framework is run in the second speech of the affirmative, where they argue that they should be able to weigh the entirety of the affirmative against the entirety of the critique. This is best for debate for X, Y, Z, and because of that, we have better education and better fairness when we debate, and that's good for debate because then, you know, we get education and fairness, and that's super awesome. And then the K has to win some sort of framework on their end. So when they run framework as the F, the neg will respond in their one of their second speeches. And then we have a framework round. Generally, the framework round comes top level, so they have to agree on some sort of framework before you can evaluate anything on the K level. I personally did this. I don't know if a lot of K teams do this, probably because usually if you're running a K, you're doing a one-off K. That means you only run a critique. Framework ends up being really big. The affirmative will run disadvantages on framework. The negative will run disadvantages on framework. You have the role of the ballot, the role of the judge. There's a lot in framework, and you need to have a framework shell no matter what. Role of the ballot is just like what the ballot should do and what it symbolizes, and then you have role of the judge. Role of the judge is how the judge should act. Then you have the debate on counter standards of like what is best for debate, and counter voters, which is the education fairness or fairness education, which comes first, how those two interact. And that's only if you have a big K round. Generally, this happens with, again, like I was saying, K teams. So for me personally, I ran a lot of Ks, and when you run one-off K, the round is one sheet of framework, one sheet of the critique, and then the affirmative has a really hard time answering everything and extending their AF. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, cool. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. It is 11:05. Y'all are free to leave. If you want, I'm going to end the recording here.